Hey there, friends. Welcome back to another Legally Armed America video. I'm, of course, Paul Glasgow here. Guys, I have an interesting one for you today. A little bit of a scratch of the surface of some of the goofiness goes on inside our military, especially under the previous administration. Quick side note, not a whole lot to talk about today regarding the Epstein list, the debacle that came out yesterday. This was like the Geraldo Rivera uncovering the tomb of Al Capone or some BS. It was a nothing burger. So apologies for that. I waited thinking we had something and we didn't. So anyway, my story today is going to be surrounding the uproar that the current Trump administration is doing to make our military more ready and more safe. First, guys, go check out my friends, Attorneys on Retainer. I've told you guys before, don't trust an insurance company if you do carry a firearm on your side every single day for self-protection. Trust actual attorneys. That's what you get with Attorneys on Retainer. Whenever you call, you do not get Bob from India. You get an actual attorney. And that's a big deal because whenever your future is on the line because you had to draw your self-defense firearm, it's very important you talk to the right person to keep you, hopefully, out of jail. Sign up now with my friends over at Attorneys on Retainer for optimum protection in the unlikely event you have to draw your carry firearm. Use my code FTATF. Again, FTATF is my code, and you will receive $50 off of your individual sign-up fee or $25 off of your family plan sign-up fee. Attorneys on Retainer, check them out. So the Pentagon is shaking things up a little bit regarding the transgender population that I think is overestimated in their current military. And a lot of that has to do with readiness. Our troops should be, why should we candy coat it? The most deadly out there. I'm not looking for the sweetest. I'm not looking for the most compassionate. I want the most stone cold killer that we could have out there and the most effective stone cold killer. So when I say stone cold killer, I don't mean somebody with a mental disorder that's capable of ending their own life or somebody else's because they're mad that might be on their team. I'm talking about the enemy. Here's a report on the change by the Pentagon and the Trump administration regarding transgender in the military.
Plans to remove transgender troops from the U.S. military if they don't meet certain requirements. In a memo made public in a court filing, the order says in part, quote, the medical, surgical, and mental health constraints on individuals who have a current diagnosis or history of gender dysphoria are incompatible with the high mental and physical standards necessary for military service. Transgender service members now have 30 days to voluntarily leave the military or be removed. A defense official told CBS News last month there are more than 4,200 active duty service members with gender dysphoria. A 2014 UCLA analysis of survey data from transgender people found that about 134,000 veterans or retired reservists or Guard members identified as trans. Last month, I spoke with Sherry Swakowski, a retired Army colonel and the highest-ranking openly transgender veteran in the U.S., about the risks of removing transgender troops from the military.
What they bring is an important part of themselves, their full, authentic self. You know, the armed forces are not as robust as they used to be. And if you're talking about discharging thousands of fully qualified service members, from a strategic perspective, that creates vulnerabilities and opportunities for our adversaries to exploit.
For more, let's bring in CBS News senior national security correspondent Charlie D'Agata. Charlie, the Pentagon has ordered the military to establish procedures to identify transgender troops within 30 days. How are they doing this, and are there concerns about privacy violations?
There are many concerns about privacy violations, Lindsay. In fact, this memo is in relation to a court case brought up by two advocacy groups challenging the legality of the ban on transgender forces. The advocate group Sparta Pride sent out a statement in part reading, no policy will ever erase transgender Americans' contribution to history, warfighting, or military excellence. So we got to point out that this is essentially a ban on all transgender service members because of the language used in that memo filed on the court on Wednesday. Within 30 days, Pentagon must identify these individuals. Now listen to this, who have a current diagnosis, history of, exhibit symptoms consistent with gender dysphoria. That's the medical term for emotional stress caused by when a person's biological sex doesn't match their identity. So under that ban that President Trump first put in during his first term, transgender members who had come out prior and had been taking medication and had transitioned, they could continue to serve and receive medical care. And those who had not come out before the ban had to serve whatever biological sex they were born with. So this afternoon, the senior official repeated that number you quoted, 4,200 service members in Guard, well below estimates. But again, those are the people who've been diagnosed with dysphoria.
The memo says some troops may be considered for a waiver on a case-by-case basis. What does that mean?
Yeah, so the language that I just repeated there really doesn't appear to give much wiggle room. There is certainly no guarantees. That's what we have been told. That's not a surprise. The policy says that some service members may be considered on a case-by-case basis, provided there is compelling government interest. Now, the DOD has not elaborated on that because, frankly, we haven't even got a statement from the DOD. But if you were to read into it, considers certain individuals hold certain positions in the military. The memo goes on to say that a soldier must demonstrate 36 consecutive months of stability in the service member's sex in order to obtain an exemption. So 3 years of behavior consistent with their birthed sex. Stability.
Okay. I got to be quick with you on this. What are you hearing internally within the DOD in response to this?
Look, Lindsay, the Pentagon, the DOD, they will do what they're told to do, right? They're here to follow orders. But I have spoken to trans service members who said, look, we're up to the job. We passed the physical fitness constraints of this job. We want to serve our country. These are individuals who, by the way, were banned under Trump in the first administration, brought back after Biden reversed that order, and now they're facing the same sort of ordeal. But they say they're going to fight. They're going to fight for their country. They're going to fight for their jobs and fight for these issues.
So let me address that report real quick before we move into more of my findings on this thing that these people are being dishonest about in the mainstream legacy-run media and the state-run media. These people are liars, and they're still mad that Trump is president, and they're trying to defend old policies that put not only our military members at risk and all the people in the military, but us Americans, because don't we rely on the military to protect the borders of the United States, whatever that meant under the previous administration? But they cite numbers in this CBS report, and I dispute those numbers. I do not believe in any way possible that the numbers that they are putting out there are accurate, because these numbers, they don't even reflect the general population. In fact, if we've got 4,240 active duty service members diagnosed with gender dysphoria, and 134,000 veterans, retired reservists of the Guard, with this same diagnosis, kind of what that tells me is, since this population of mentally deranged people only make up less than 1% of the population, if it's this lopsided with so many of them in the military to not be reflective of the population, meaning less than 1%, then clearly this is a funneling of these mentally deranged people going into the military, because the numbers are higher in the military than what the general population is. Now, one thing I want to point out that this new policy actually does reflect, and I think it's their attempt at being fair with some of these mentally deranged people, is that they say that the gender dysphoria people have to have 36 consecutive months of stability. And of course, the news people scoff at that. I think that's the military's way of saying, we recognize this is a mental disorder. We just want to see you be consecutively stable. That's what we're looking for, because we're going to be handing you a firearm with a standard capacity magazine of at least 30 rounds in it. We'd like for you to be stable, if that's not too much to ask. First, guys, let's take a look back at the policy that it's changing from. This is an entire handbook that the Biden administration created to tell the transgender people and the people who had to, let's say, govern over them in the military, how to handle their delicate situation. They titled the handout Military Service by Transgender Persons and Persons with Gender Dysphoria. basically the same thing, and implementation handbook. Let's just address this real quick. Transgender persons and persons with gender dysphoria are the exact same thing. It's just that transgender persons, some of them cannot be diagnosed yet with gender dysphoria. Every person who is a transgender person has gender dysphoria. So we're talking about the same thing. It's just a matter of diagnosis. At what point has the transgender person actually been diagnosed with the accurate description of gender dysphoria? So again, two different words or two different phrases, but they mean the same thing as far as the condition of the person's mental status. Now, one of the first things that jumped out at me under considerations was gender transition may have an impact on several different aspects of your career, talking to the transgender soldier, military person, whatever, including deployability, assignment consideration, medical classification, and individual readiness, aspects of individual readiness. That's important. It's very important that we understand it's not just something that happens. It affects a lot of different things, and a lot of this may have to do with the medication a person is on, the fact that they are quote unquote transitioning. But it's certainly identified in this handbook very early on that we're talking about a mental condition, and they really are really sensitive about how they tiptoe around the subject. Now, in this section, it actually refers to the actual service member who is diagnosed with gender dysphoria. Notice down here where I have the box, these service members may consult with a military medical provider and receive mental health counseling, but they may not obtain a gender marker change in DEERS or serve in their preferred gender. The point that I wanted to make here is you're paying for all this. Anytime that there is military medical provider involved or you're receiving mental health counseling, that's all a pass-through cost to the taxpayer. We're paying for this. And this is why that number earlier, that over 4,000 transgender people in the military, why I think that number is so high. And I'll show you here in a second, the medications that these people go on and the transitioning, it's not possible, surgery that they have, they're very expensive, they're costly. And the fact that the federal government has a policy to cover the cost of all of that and simply pass it on to the American taxpayer is part of the reason why these people were flocking to the military. In fact, the military, obviously, having their DEI initiatives, were seeking out these people. And that's why we were seeing a decline in the really good warriors not applying for the military. That's why you're seeing a spike in the warrior attitude as far as going into the military right now, because they finally see the getting rid of the sugar in the military, if you want to put it in more street terms. More on the readiness portion, medical care for gender dysphoria, including medical and surgical transition, is managed in the same ways as medical care for other medical conditions. You may be non-deployable for some periods during your gender transition period. It's your responsibility to inform your leadership regarding your medical condition when, as a result of any medical treatment, you will be or have become non-deployable according to your service's deployability policies. Now, the one thing they don't address right here, and again, this is a handbook that was drawn up by the DEI-driven Biden policy or Biden administration, is they don't talk about the health issues. They talk about medical care right here, and they talk about medical conditions. They talk about all these things in reference to deployability, but they don't mention the health side of it regarding your mental health. That, to me, is a much bigger thing than anything else. You may have somebody with a medical related or medical health related issue if they're in the process of getting their balls cut off or something like that. Maybe if they're a woman and they're getting their cans removed. Those things right there might be the medical preventative thing that doesn't allow you to be deployed. But they're completely sidestepping the humongous elephant in the room, which is the mental health side of this, not the physical side of this. Now, there's also directions for the commander. Whoever you report to is also got some things that they need to learn. This was the most eye-opening to me. What you should expect from the military medical provider Just like other behavioral health conditions, they actually address health conditions, behavioral health right here, meaning mental health, treatable by mental health counseling. You may not be notified of a service member's diagnosis of gender dysphoria. Well, that's just great. So you have somebody responsible for determining whether or not somebody is deployable or ready, fit to go out there and fight the enemy and take their lives, but yet you're going to hide information that has a direct impact on their mental state. I think that in itself is an inherent danger. Now, the DOD back during the Biden administration also put this thing out. 5 things to know about DOD's new policy on military service by transgender persons and persons with gender dysphoria. Again, we're talking about the same thing. If you go to number 3, they call it the new policy is focused on enhancing readiness and comes after consultation with military and medical experts. I want to point this out on there. Actually talk about it right here. Persons with a history of gender dysphoria, a serious medical condition. They themselves define this. This is a military DOD website. They're calling gender dysphoria, which again applies to every single person who is pretending to be a different gender. They're referring to it as a serious medical condition. It's actually a serious mental condition, but at least they're addressing this. And who have undergone certain medical treatment for gender dysphoria, such as cross-sex hormone therapy or sex reassignment surgery. That's where you lop off the figs or you take the cans off, or are unwilling or unable to meet the standards associated with their biological sex, could adversely impact unit readiness and combat effectiveness. Again, they simply talk about the physical side of it and do not discuss the negative issues regarding these people having a mental disorder that needs to be treated. More on that treatment in a second. It's important that we understand this. I know I've seen questions online, and if you Google it, you'll see the same thing, where people are asking, because we've heard some things out there, are these transitioning people, and let's not even say transitioning, let's say these trans people, are these gender dysphoria people deployable? Well, if you just ask the question simply, yes, they are deployable. But there's an asterisk. If they're in the process of transitioning, they're not deployable. Why? Because of the unstableness of their health, they will tell you. But it's kind of a wink because they are acknowledging without saying it, it's really an unstableness up here. They just don't want to offend anybody. Again, previous administration, things are changing right now. Want to know another reason why I don't want one of these gender pretenders in a foxhole next to my true warrior? If you go to the NIH website, you will find a study out there, and I've read several studies over the years on this phenomenon. Suicide risk among transgender people, a prevalent problem in critical need of empirical and theoretical research. The first sentence in this entire study reads, transgender individuals are at increased risk for suicide relative to non-transgender people. Same study from the NIH says, transgender individuals are at higher risk for suicide relative to non-transgender people. One study in Sweden showed that transgender individuals undergoing gender affirmation surgery, this is the quote transition we just discussed, were at 19 times greater risk for dying by suicide than the general population. So anybody going through the actual quote transition process had a 19-time greater risk of taking their own life. 18 to 45%, that is humongous. That's approaching half of transgender adults and youth have attempted suicide in their lifetime. Now, I've talked about this before about the cry for help. So many people confuse somebody coming out as being transgender. I've stated it many, many times. Sometimes, especially since these are usually and almost always younger people, it's a cry for help. They don't know how to ask for help. They don't know how to say, I'm confused about what I might or might not be. So sometimes they come out because they're encouraged to by other people. And instead of us addressing the problem they have, we celebrate it and parade them around town and ask them to dress up different. That is contributing to almost half of these people attempting suicide. And you have to think that if this many people are attempting suicide, some of those attempts might be your cry for help. In other words, you've read stories and you've read instances where people attempted to take their own lives. I'm not going to give you a how-to on that, but if you fail at that, sometimes I gotta think you probably just didn't really try. And sometimes whenever they have a lackluster attempt at that, maybe that's their way of saying, nobody is taking notice, you're celebrating me, maybe this is my step a little bit closer towards you actually helping me now, instead of making my problem worse. Now, one of the things that we have to realize is a lot of what they're talking about here as far as the treatment and care of these transgender people, including those in the military, don't think that those in the military aren't on some kind of a psychotropic drug. And I'm not talking about just the trans people. People in general are on psychotropic drugs. Almost all of them, maybe all of them eventually, as far as the trans community, they go on psychotropic drugs. These psychotropic drugs are not healthy, especially not for your mental state. Sticking with NIH studies, I found one that read antidepressant prescribing in transgender and non-binary individuals diagnosed with gender dysphoria and mood or anxiety disorders. My first highlighted area up there says psychotherapy and gender-affirming medical interventions demonstrate significant reductions in symptoms of depression, anxiety, and number of suicide attempts in transgender non-binary individuals experiencing gender dysphoria. So this is telling you that these people have a problem and it needs to be medicated. This problem, the side effects of it, have symptoms of depression, anxiety, and suicide attempts. A little bit below that, however, high out-of-pocket costs as well as variability in length of time before noticeable improvement of psychiatric symptoms remain significant challenges to gender-affirming care. In the general population, antidepressants are the treatment of choice for mood and anxiety-related disorders with selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, that's SSRIs, you hear me talk about that a lot, being the most commonly prescribed class of antidepressants. What this paragraph demonstrates here is the reason why we see a spike of the military having a high number of these people being funneled into it. Because the cost for not only your care and these drugs are extremely high, but the surgeries associated with it, if you really want to commit to it, are very high too. And again, this is simply passed on to the American people as far as the cost. But it's very important that we also recognize that SSRIs are the drug of choice almost overwhelmingly with trans people. This next slide reads, although the number of active antidepressant prescriptions between gender identities were similar in this study, we found 38% of patients were not prescribed any antidepressants at the time of gender dysphoria and mood or anxiety related disorders. That's important right there. I think that is a critical number, that you see that even though these people need some kind of medication, some kind of treatment of some sort, 38% of the people did not have any kind of treatment that they were receiving. Now, I'm not saying that SSRIs are the trick. I'm not saying they're the fix. I think the pharmaceutical industry wants you to think that. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is there are treatments, some may be non-medical treatments out there, but I think we have to acknowledge that about 40% of this mental disorder population is running around untreated out there. The last sentence says, this serendipitous finding elucidates a potential gap in mental health care among transgender adults, stating again that clearly there are unmedicated people running around there that require medication for this serious mental disorder. Now, you guys know I've talked a lot in my book, How to Make a Monster, about the effect of psychotropics, SSRIs, mood-altering drugs on the minds of people, especially the young minds. Young minds do not finish developing. The brain physically finishes developing at a very early age, but it doesn't finish developing personality, traits, habits until about 26 years of age. Problem with that is we are rewiring those brains with the likes of SSRIs. And I don't want to go too much into it. I talk about it in my book at pretty great length. But as far as dopamine, serotonin, a lot of those things are treated differently in the brain, blocked in the brain, allowed to go through in the brain in some cases. The part of the brain that all this medication affects and the part of the brain that's not fully developed at that point is the part of the brain, prefrontal cortex, that's still developing, again, habits, mood, personality, quirks, anything that has something to do, again, personality is probably the best word for it, but all those things right here are not developed, and these drugs directly impact that. And again, we're not finishing the development of that part of the brain until 26 years of age, when many of these people are well into years and years of taking those SSRIs, which is rewiring the brain to function differently than it would have if you had not exposed the brain to those SSRIs. One of my biggest problems with these SSRIs is that they have FDA black box warnings on them. First paragraph, the Federal Drug Administration issued a black box label warning indicating that the use of certain antidepressants to treat major depressive disorder in adolescents may increase the risk of suicidal ideation and behavior. In fact, some countries have actually outlawed the use of SSRIs because of this very reason. You can see the next page, and again, I'm pulling this from the AMA Journal of Ethics. Next page says, first sentence, in addition to the unknown cost of increased suicidality risk, I thought that was very ironic. When you're finding a study within the medical industry, and the first thing it says is, we're not talking necessarily about the mental risk, we're talking about the unknown cost of increased suicidality risk. What about the cost to humanity? What about the cost to the people who are suffering with these conditions? Because I really do care about these people and I want them to get help. But this study is saying that, we're not really worried about what it's doing to the person. What is it costing society, our communities? I thought that was a really odd take by what we should already expect from the pharmaceutical industry, who could give two rips about any of our health or mental health. This same study goes on to say FDA has determined that the following points are appropriate for inclusion in the box warnings. Antidepressants increase the risk of suicidal thinking and behavior suicidality in children and adolescents with depression and other psychiatric disorders. Anyone considering the use of an antidepressant in a child or adolescent for any clinical use must balance the risk of increased suicidality with the clinical need. Patients who are started on therapy should be observed closely for clinical worsening, suicidality, or unusual changes in behavior. A lot of those unusual changes in behavior also include irrational behavior and mania. Families and caregivers should be advised to closely observe the patient and to communicate with the prescriber. And finally, a statement regarding whether the particular drug is appropriate for any pediatric indications, and so which ones. Why are we giving SSRIs that's completely rewiring the brain to any kind of child receiving pediatric care? That's another big problem. We're prescribing some of these mood-altering drugs to children at such a young age that we will never know how that child would have actually been naturally, because we're rewiring their brain for the course of years and years and years. And in some cases, we're introducing them to drugs at an early age as being, that's the fix. You're not going to be normal unless you're taking pills. I think that's a horrible approach. I'm not saying people out there who are taking drugs, they don't help you. What I'm saying is, at an early age, learning that you are going to be reliant for the rest of your life on taking a pill, or you can't function. I can't go to work today. I didn't get my script filled. I think those are real things to worry about. And I think conditioning a child at a very young age that they are not normal unless they're taking pills is a real problem. Now, the recent black box warnings that I talk about, these things are serious. Look down the center there. Excess sedation, risk of sudden loss of consciousness, sleep behaviors possibly resulting in death, sedation and disassociation, abuse and misuse, increased risk of suicide in younger patients. What that one above it says, where abuse and misuse, that's where people are self-medicating. They're self-treating themselves. You know, how many times have you heard somebody say, I need another nerve pill, or I need another happy pill? They're self-medicating themselves, which is abuse. Increased risk of death in geriatric patients with dementia. Great. Just what I want to give to my dementia-ridden grandparent. Now, here are two black box warnings on two very popular drugs, Paxil, and this next one is Prozac. First sentence, antidepressants increase the risk compared to placebo of suicidal thinking and behavior in children, adolescents, and young adults in short-term studies of major depressive disorder and other psychiatric disorders. Quick side note on some of these studies, I actually ran across another study that this was interesting. This paragraph right here, ever since the FDA issued a black box warning for antidepressants in 2004. This message has been mandated by law to be on the packaging. There's a link right there that says, see here for examples of all SSRI black box warnings for child suicide. Guess what? When you click on the link, this is what you find. Sorry, the page you requested cannot be found. I don't care what anybody says, Big Pharma controls a lot. And I think a lot of things that sometimes we look at as, oh, that's just an error. Sometimes the scrubbing of information for you to educate yourself might be very subtle to where you think it's an accident. I don't think it's an accident. These people pay lots of money for really well-working websites, and I don't think they get errors on them whenever they have a broken link or something like that. I think broken links are broken on purpose. The reason why I bring this up is because I have to go back to all the people whining and crying about the current administration doing something about the readiness and mental health of the current people in our military. We are trying to re-strengthen our military to improve it upon what happened to it over the last 4 years. The only way to do that is one of two things. One, address the actual problems that exist there already, which is a lot of people with a serious mental condition. They themselves admit that gender dysphoria, which affects every single person who is pretending to be a different gender, is a serious mental condition. Why would you ever want to put somebody who is either unprescribed medication, so they're being untreated for their mental condition, in a foxhole? And I use the foxhole analogy. I know we're not doing a lot of fighting in foxholes, but you understand my point. Why would I want to put an unstable person who's got a serious medical condition, according to you, in a foxhole with somebody who doesn't? Give them both numerous rounds, grenades, and other things like that, and then throw a bunch of anxiety on top of them because now they're fighting an enemy. Put the same person in the same foxhole, treated now, but the treatment gives them suicidality or mania. I don't think either one of those scenarios is something that our military guys, the true warriors wanting to sign up in the military, want. They may not say it openly, so I'll say it for them. They don't want that. They don't want to mention it because why? They'll get shamed. Now, granted, things are changing in society right now where you can say more things openly without somebody shaming you, or we can shame the people who are trying to shame us. And I think that's what we need to do more of. We don't do a good enough job of shaming the shamers out there. When you come at me trying to guilt me or gaslight me into something, don't take it. Push it back on them and shame them for being pansies. Shame them for weakening our military. These two reporters right here, they should be shamed, because they are trying to spin this as a negative whenever truly, and I truly believe this, I don't think people wish harm on that trans community. And I know that's a word I don't even like to use because it's made up itself. But I don't wish harm on them. They have a mental condition. They have a mental problem. I would like to see them get help. I don't wish harm on them. And I think most of the conservative community, right-leaning community, and the general public in general want these people to get help. But I don't want to give them the help they need while they're holding an M4 with a 30-round magazine in it and a bunch of grenades slung around their neck with my true warrior buddy next to them. I don't want that. Give them the treatment they need when and where they need it, not at the expense of other people who are trying to do the right thing to protect the good American people in this country.
I'm sorry, I thought this was America. He's so horrible.